The universe had a hierarchy, and humans occupied the sort of position that one might describe as optimistically ignored. The collective, that bloated confederation of silicon-based life forms, crystalline philosophy, and beings composed primarily of indignation, had collectively decided that humanity was roughly equivalent to an ant farm, mildly interesting, fundamentally harmless, and absolutely not worth the computational resources required to take seriously. The fact that humanity kept existing despite this assessment was considered more of an inconvenience than a threat. But inconveniences have a way of becoming problems, and problems have a way of arriving at the worst possible moments. The research facility orbited a dying star in a sector of space that had never been important enough to name properly. It was simply designated by a series of numbers and mathematical symbols that, when translated into human phonetics, sounded like someone sneezing through a sheet of bubble wrap. The facility itself was a monument to improvisation, bolted together sections of hull plating, corridors that seemed to turn in directions that hurt to think about, and laboratories where humans and their various contracted alien colleagues worked in that special kind of tension that comes from being mutually assured of each other's incompetence. At Station Theta 7, as the humans had decided to call it, because they were constitutionally incapable of leaving well enough alone, the end of the known universe was being quietly managed by a team of scientists who had stopped sleeping approximately 4 days ago. Their eyes had developed that special kind of glassiness that suggested they were running on stimulants, caffeine, and the kind of desperate hope usually reserved for lottery tickets. On a smaller table, positioned near a window that overlooked absolutely nothing important, a young human was assembling a puzzle. This would have been unremarkable, except for the fact that beside her, cooling with the ponderous inevitability of all significant weapons technology, sat the Chronal Disruptor. It was a device that had taken 3 years, 2 civilizations, and enough mathematical certainty to break the careers of 4 quantum physicists to construct. It looked, quite honestly, like someone had built a coffin out of chrome, added far too many blinking lights, and then forgotten what it was actually supposed to do. The device was supposed to tear a hole in the fabric of spacetime itself, or seal one. The scientists had honestly stopped being clear on that particular detail somewhere around month 18 of the project. The girl did not appear concerned about this. Her hands moved with methodical precision, rotating puzzle pieces with the efficiency of someone who had performed this exact calculation in their head 7 times already. The puzzle depicted a landscape, mountains in a shade of blue that probably didn't exist in nature, trees in a shade of green that definitely didn't, and a sky that seemed to have been colored by someone with only a vague conceptual understanding of how color worked. It was the sort of puzzle that cost 3 credits, and came from a vendor who operated in the kind of stalls found on space stations where nobody asked questions. Around her, the facility hummed with the particular frequency of organized panic. Scientists moved through the corridors like particles in a magnetic field, bouncing off walls. Other scientists, in the cold realization that their project, the one they had dedicated their lives to, was either going to save humanity or demonstrate, beyond any shadow of doubt, that humans should never have attempted to play with forces that required their own scientific notation. The head researcher, a woman whose hair had gone from auburn to something more accurately described as statistically determined white, over the course of the project, stood before a window, watching the stars beyond, or rather watching the precise point in spacetime where a star should exist but didn't, because 3 weeks ago, something had gone spectacularly wrong with the universe, and the fabric of reality had decided to develop what could only be described as a tear, a rift, a wound, a temporal infection spreading like the most catastrophic version of a paper cut that had ever existed. The collective had given humanity an ultimatum: fix it within the month, or humanity would be forcibly relocated to the outer territories where it could learn to terraform planets that had things like corrosive atmospheres and sentient acid clouds. This was the collective's way of being merciful, which told you quite a bit about the collective's baseline understanding of mercy. The project had been humanity's idea. When the rift first appeared, consuming a satellite outpost and 2 drones, the human contingent had done what humans always did when faced with impossible problems. They proposed an even more impossible solution. Instead of evacuating, they suggested they could build a device that would exploit the rift's own temporal mechanics to seal it from the inside. It was mad. It was theoretically unsound. It required 3 different species to agree on the same mathematical proof, which historically had never happened in the history of space exploration. And yet here it was. The Chronal Disruptor, powered by a stellar core harvested from a binary star system, calibrated to frequencies that probably violated several universal laws, and currently cooling on a table next to a girl who was focused on sliding a puzzle piece into place with the seriousness of someone defusing a bomb. The irony was delicious. For once humanity wasn't the species creating the problem. For once they were the ones trying to fix it. The collective found this deeply unsettling, for reasons they couldn't quite articulate, which probably explained why they had stationed observers throughout the facility, crystalline entities whose primary function seemed to be recording everything and judging it silently. The girl fit the final piece into the puzzle and sat back, examining her work. The landscape was now complete, a perfectly contained world of impossible colors and improbable geography. She set the puzzle to the side and glanced at the Chronal Disruptor. Its lights were changing color, blue to amber, amber to red. The cooling process was entering its final stages. In approximately 6 hours the device would be activated. In approximately 6 hours and 30 minutes, one of three things would happen. The rift would seal, the station would catastrophically explode, or something even more interesting would occur. The scientists had stopped calculating which outcome was statistically most likely after they realized that all three were, bizarrely, equally probable. The girl picked up a second puzzle from the pile beside her. This one depicted an ocean, waves frozen mid-crash against rocks, foam rendered in shades of white so bright they seemed to glow. She began sorting the pieces, creating small piles, edges, corners, center section. The deliberate, methodical work of someone completely unbothered by the fact that the universe was unraveling, and humanity's entire future rested on a device that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood physics, but had never actually built anything before. This was the thing about humans that the collective had never quite understood. When faced with apocalypse, they did not panic uniformly. Some panicked completely, others became eerily calm, and a select few, just found something to do with their hands and waited to see what would happen next. The collective had assumed this made humans unreliable. They had never considered the possibility that it made them dangerous. 3 solar systems away, in a space station shaped like an impossible geometric figure that had been designed by entities who experienced mathematics as a sensory input, the collective's High Council was experiencing something remarkably close to what humans might describe as alarm. Not panic. The collective did not panic, but something in the neighborhood of panic's annoying cousin, who kept showing up uninvited and eating your food. The holographic displays showed the expanding rift with callous precision. Each frame represented 1 hour. The rift was growing, not dramatically, not in the way that would justify immediate military intervention, but steadily, inevitably, like the kind of patient destruction that came from understanding exactly how something should be broken. Ambassador Crystalline Consensus 7, a designation that took approximately 47 seconds to properly vocalize in any organic language, observed the data with what might have been described as skepticism. If crystalline life forms were capable of the kind of emotional nuance required for skepticism, what they were actually experiencing was the computational equivalent of a raised eyebrow. The humans, another delegate stated, its photonic pattern creating waves of blue light that made meaning from pure illumination, are going to fail. This is statistically inevitable. Their species achieves approximately 83% failure rates on projects of this complexity. Yes, Crystalline Consensus 7 replied, its response carrying harmonics of something approaching agreement. However, we must consider that they have also achieved what we considered theoretically impossible on no fewer than 4 occasions. Once through accident, 3 times through accident compounded by accident. This was the problem with humans. They were not supposed to be capable. Their neural architecture was inferior, their lifespans were insignificant. Their technological development had proceeded at a rate that should have resulted in self-destruction, approximately 7 times over. And yet here they were, still existing, still building, still somehow advancing despite breaking every recognized law of civilizational progression. It was irritating. Back at Station Theta 7, the head researcher stood in the observation room, watching the cooling device through reinforced transparent aluminum. The scientists' hands shook slightly. A human biological function they had learned to hide over years of professional development, but which betrayed itself under sufficient stress. The data streaming across the monitors was good, too good actually. The kind of good that made survival statisticians nervous because it meant the universe owed them a significant debt, and the universe had a way of collecting its debts with interest. The girl with the puzzle had moved to the facility's common area, a space designed by someone with no understanding of human ergonomics but excellent intention. She sat in the corner, where the angular walls created an approximation of a nook, and continued her methodical assembly of the ocean puzzle. Around her, scientists moved in tight orbits, discussing probability matrices and temporal mechanics in the kind of jargon that had probably never been intended for human mouths. One of the alien observers, a being composed primarily of electromagnetic fields held together by confidence and spite, approached the observation window. Its designation translated roughly to witness, which was as poetic as the collective usually got. "Your species is completing the device on schedule," Witness stated, its voice like static given structure and purpose. "This contradicts all predictive models." The head researcher didn't look away from the monitor. "We're also running on 8 days of stimulants and the kind of desperate motivation that comes from knowing everyone on your homeworld is watching you fail in real time. That should result in decreased performance, not increased precision." "Yeah, well, desperation and panic are a lot like falling. Humans are good at falling. We've had a lot of practice. Eventually you learn to do it correctly." Witness's form flickered in what might have been the electromagnetic equivalent of confusion. The collective had spent centuries trying to understand human motivation. The standard models suggested that species with such short lifespans and limited cognitive resources should prioritize resource acquisition and territorial expansion. Humans did this, certainly, but they also seemed to operate on some kind of secondary program that sometimes overrode their basic survival instincts. They sacrificed. They cooperated despite personal cost. They built things that had no practical value, except the fact that they existed and could be appreciated by others. It made no sense. Across the facility, in a sealed chamber where the real work happened, 2 human engineers and a visiting consultant from a silicon-based collective were making the final calibrations to the Chronal Disruptor's temporal matrix. The device hummed with an almost musical quality, a vibration that suggested it was aware of its own importance, and was trying to convey this through oscillation. "The harmonic frequency is stabilizing," one of the engineers said, checking readouts that displayed information in 17 different formats, because apparently no single species could agree on how data should be presented. "We're at 98.3% efficient. That's better than our conservative models predicted." "Better is not the same as adequate," the silicon-based consultant replied, its logical structure seeing no reason to celebrate preliminary success. "Better means we have slightly increased probability of not catastrophically failing. It also means we have proportionally decreased probability of surviving the activation sequence." "Weird, right?" the engineer said. "It's like the universe is saying you either succeed completely, or fail so hard that success becomes irrelevant." This was actually, the engineer would later reflect, the most accurate summary of human-universe relations that had ever been articulated. Meanwhile, in the common area, the girl had begun working on the ocean puzzle, with the kind of methodical focus that suggested she was mentally solving each section before physically assembling it. Pieces moved from the sorting piles to the main structure, with an efficiency that indicated she was not thinking about the work at all. Her hands were simply implementing calculations. Her subconscious had already completed. Another scientist observed this with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching paint dry in advanced temporal mechanics. "She's doing something," the scientist said to their colleague, which was perhaps the vaguest observation in the history of vague observation. "Yes, humans tend to do things," the colleague replied. "This is actually what distinguishes them from inanimate objects." "No, I mean, she's solving it faster than statistically possible. She's not even looking at most of the pieces. She's just placing them." This was how humanity had gotten to this point, actually, not through grand scientific breakthroughs or revolutionary insights.
through the accumulation of small observations. Someone noticed that something could be done a different way. Someone else built on that observation. Someone else broke it down even further. Generation after generation of humans doing small things slightly better, until those small improvements accumulated into something that couldn't be ignored anymore. The collective had assumed this made humans merely persistent. They had never quite grasped that persistence, when combined with lateral thinking and the human capacity to sometimes break their own rules, when existing rules produced suboptimal results, was actually a form of competence that the standard models had no category for. By the time they realized this, it was far too late. 6 hours until activation. The Chronal Disruptor sat in its chamber, fully assembled, fully calibrated, and waiting with the patient inevitability of a weapon that had been built by species who didn't quite know they were building a weapon. They thought they were building a salvation. They thought they were building a solution. In reality, they had built something that would prove to every civilization in the known universe that humans should never, under any circumstances, be underestimated. The girl placed the final piece of her second puzzle into place. Ocean complete. 2 puzzles finished. 2 demonstrations of pattern recognition and spatial reasoning, executed perfectly despite the presence of an apocalyptic rift in spacetime, and a device that could theoretically destroy everything within 50 light years. She picked up a third puzzle. In the observation chamber, witness recorded everything. The collective would need to understand this moment eventually. They would need to explain how a species so thoroughly dismissed had somehow become central to galactic survival. They would need to find a way to describe the peculiar alchemy that happened when desperation met determination met the human capacity to remain functionally casual in the face of existential stakes. They would ultimately fail at this task. The collective would spend decades trying to categorize and understand human behavior. They would develop entire new branches of study devoted to the paradox of human unreliability being simultaneously the most reliable force in the known universe. None of it would make sense until much later, when someone finally realized that humans had never been unreliable at all. They had simply been playing by a completely different set of rules that nobody else had bothered to read.
The negotiation chamber existed in a state of tense symmetry. On one side, humanity's delegation, a carefully selected group of diplomats, scientists, and one individual, whose official title was strategic consultant, but whose actual job involved understanding what everyone else meant when they said things. On the other side, the collective's representatives, along with delegates from the Harmonic Communion, the Probability Consortium, and approximately 6 other factions that humanity had learned to work with, despite not fully understanding what any of them actually did. The tension in the chamber was the kind that could be measured on instruments. It had weight. It had presence. It was the sort of tension that arose when everyone in a room understood that the next 3 hours would determine whether billions of people lived or whether reality itself would experience what could only be described as a catastrophic system failure. The device must be dismantled, Crystalline Consensus 7 stated, its harmonic frequencies suggesting absolute certainty in a way that made disagreement seem somehow rude. You have demonstrated sufficient capability to construct it. Now demonstrate wisdom by destroying it. The human delegation's chief negotiator, a woman whose ability to remain calm under pressure had been honed over years of dealing with bureaucratic nightmares and family reunions, leaned forward slightly. Dismantling the device at this stage would cause a cascade failure in the temporal matrix. The rift would expand exponentially. You understand this, right? You've seen the data. The data suggests you have lost control of the situation, another delegate responded. Its photonic patterns radiating something that might have been concern if photonic beings were capable of being concerned about anything other than energy efficiency. The logical response is to retreat and allow trained specialists to address the problem. Your trained specialists told us it was impossible, the human diplomat replied, and there was something in her voice that suggested she had been saving this statement for exactly this moment. 3 different governments, 4 different species, and a probability algorithm that had never been wrong before all agreed that sealing a temporal rift from inside was impossible. So we did it anyway, because your species' version of possible is apparently just suggestion. This was the fundamental problem with negotiating with humans. They were fundamentally incapable of respecting the established hierarchy of impossibility. Where other species saw absolute barriers, humans saw challenges. Where others saw laws of physics, humans saw guidelines with loopholes. Back at the facility, the girl had moved into the observation chamber. She stood quietly, watching the Chronal Disruptor through the reinforced window, with an expression that suggested she was thinking about something, though what exactly was unclear. The scientists around her had stopped noticing her presence approximately 4 days ago, which was perhaps why they didn't realize she was slowly working through a series of calculations in her head. The head researcher was communicating with the negotiation team through a secure channel, relaying real-time data about the device's condition. Everything was proceeding perfectly, too perfectly, the kind of perfect that made experienced scientists nervous because in their experience, perfection usually meant you had misunderstood something fundamental about the problem. 3 hours until activation, the researcher reported, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hand. All systems nominal, temporal matrix holding at 100% coherence. We're ready. The collective demands a full shutdown and inspection, the diplomat replied. They're saying the device poses an uncontrollable risk. The rift poses an uncontrollable risk. The device is our attempt to control that. If they want to stop us, they're welcome to try, but they should understand that stopping us now means accepting the rift, instead of fighting it. They seem to think those are both acceptable outcomes. They're not. The girl turned away from the window and approached the head researcher. She didn't say anything initially. She simply waited until the researcher noticed her, which took approximately 30 seconds because the researcher was currently engaged in 3 different conversations simultaneously through 3 different communication channels. The researcher asked, as if speaking to a person who had manifested in front of them during a critical moment was somehow unremarkable. In the context of space stations and temporal rifts, it was actually well within the range of normal. You're calibrating the harmonic resonance wrong, the girl said. The researcher blinked. Slowly, the way someone blinks when they have been told something that is simultaneously obvious and incomprehensible. I'm sorry. What? The harmonic resonance. You're calibrating it to match the rift's frequency, but the rift is expanding. By the time you activate the device, the rift's frequency will have shifted 0.03 Hz. Your calibration will be off. The device won't seal the rift. It'll punch right through and create a secondary rupture, approximately 47 kilometers north of the original breach. The researcher opened their mouth, closed it, opened it again. This was the problem with having support staff aboard research stations. Sometimes they paid attention to things you were too busy to notice, and then they said things that completely rewrote your entire understanding of the situation. How do you know that? The pattern. You kept running the same calculations because they worked in your models, but your models were based on a static rift. This one isn't static. It's breathing, like it's alive or something. Growing and contract. If you just account for the oscillation instead of fighting it, if you let the device flex instead of hold rigid, you can use the rift's own expansion to seal itself. You're not stopping it. You're helping it complete its own cycle. The researcher stared at this young human, who had been assembling puzzles while the apocalypse proceeded and who had apparently spent that time calculating temporal mechanics, instead of, being appropriately concerned. That would require recalibrating the entire temporal matrix. We have 2 hours and 45 minutes, so you should probably start now instead of talking to me about it. The girl replied, and walked away to collect her puzzle materials, as if she hadn't just completely restructured the fundamental approach to a world-saving operation. Back in the negotiation chamber, the debate had evolved into something resembling controlled chaos. Various delegates were presenting counter-arguments, discussing the merits of different failure scenarios, and essentially trying to talk their way into a decision that would protect their species while not explicitly admitting that they were terrified of what might happen. The human diplomat was holding firm, presenting data with methodical precision, when her communicator buzzed. She checked it, and her expression shifted in a way that suggested either very good news or very bad news, and it was impossible to tell which without more information. We've identified a recalibration protocol, she stated calmly. If implemented in the next 2 hours, it will increase our success probability from 68% to 91%. We're implementing it now. The chamber exploded into overlapping arguments. How had they identified this protocol? Why hadn't they identified it before? What was the methodology? What were the risks? The collective's representatives moved through a series of positions, like a chess player suddenly realizing their opponent had 12 moves ahead already planned. This is a deception, crystalline consensus, 7 finally stated, its harmonic certainty cracking slightly around the edges. Humans do not operate at this level of sophistication. You are attempting to manipulate us into believing in your competence. Oh, we're not trying to manipulate you at all. The human diplomat replied with a smile that suggested she had been waiting for this exact moment. We're actually trying to save the universe. If that happens to demonstrate our competence as a side effect, that's just the universe working the way it's supposed to. You're welcome. In the observation chamber, the head researcher was implementing the calibration changes with hands that moved between steady and slightly shaky. Around them, the scientific team worked with a kind of frantic energy that suggested they understood that they were either implementing genius-level adjustments or catastrophic mistakes, and they wouldn't know which until the device activated. The girl sat in the corner, back to her puzzles, completing a third landscape illustration, with the casual certainty of someone who had already calculated 17 different outcomes, and was satisfied with the probability of success on at least 14 of them. Witness, the electromagnetic being who had been observing everything, recorded this moment with the precision of something that was required to be accurate and completely objective. The collective would want to understand that the moment when humanity proved that they were not just capable, but capable in ways that nobody had accounted for. The moment when a species that was supposed to be unreliable demonstrated that they were actually just reliable in ways nobody else had considered. 2 hours until activation. The device hummed with a different frequency now, not a weapon's hum, something more like an instrument being tuned to play a specific note. The temporal matrix flickered with new calibrations, adapting itself to work with the rift instead of against it. It's beautiful, actually, one of the engineers said, watching the data streams. In a very alien, probably going to destroy us if we made a single mistake kind of way. Most beautiful things are, another engineer replied. The negotiation chamber had descended into a kind of stunned silence. The collective was processing the implications of a species proving itself to be consistently underestimated. This was problematic from several angles, not least of which was the fact that the collective had spent 3 centuries categorizing humanity as a negligible variable. Now that variable was potentially becoming significant, and the collective had no established protocols for dealing with species that refused to stay in their assigned category. We will allow the activation to proceed, crystalline consensus, 7 stated finally, its harmonic frequencies suggesting something that might have been respect if crystalline beings could respect organic matter. However, the collective will be establishing permanent oversight of future human research initiatives. I'm sure that won't be at all condescending or unnecessarily bureaucratic, the human diplomat said with a smile, fully aware that she had just negotiated humanity's right to continue existing in a way that the collective had to officially recognize. 1 hour until activation. The girl placed the final piece of her 4th puzzle and sat back to admire her work. 4 landscapes completed, 4 demonstrations of pattern recognition, 4 silent proofs that the human mind, when focused, could accomplish calculations that seemed impossible to those who insisted on thinking in straight lines. She glanced at the Chronal Disruptor cooling on the table beside her. You're going to work, she said quietly to the device, as if it could hear her, as if certainty could be communicated through proximity and intention. Because the universe doesn't want to end today, and we're too stubborn to let it. The device, remaining appropriately silent, continued its countdown to activation. It would either seal the rift, or destroy everything. Based on everything that had happened so far, humanity was betting on option 1, despite the fact that nobody had really stopped to consider option 3, that humans, in their infinite capacity for lateral thinking and calculated rule-breaking, had built something that nobody else would have even attempted, something impossible made real through the simple human refusal to accept that it couldn't be done. The final hour arrived with the kind of inevitability that suggested the universe had been waiting for this moment, and was in fact, quite interested in seeing how it would turn out. Across the galaxy, species pressed against their observation channels,
watching as humanity either succeeded magnificently or failed catastrophically. The collective had positioned itself in the neutral zone between these outcomes, the diplomatic equivalent of covering your bets while maintaining plausible deniability. The activation chamber was a symphony of humming, clicking, and the occasional sound that could only be described as the universe holding its breath. The Chronal Disruptor stood ready, all its impossible mechanisms aligned, all its improbable calibrations. The girl had moved to the observation window, her fourth puzzle now complete and set aside, her focus entirely on the device that was about to either save or annihilate everything within several light years. The head researcher gave the final authorization sequence through the communication network. Scientists across the station began final system checks. In the negotiation chamber, everyone fell silent, even the photonic delegates dimming their patterns to something closer to respectful silence. Initiating activation sequence, the head researcher announced. Temporal matrix engaging, harmonic resonance calibrating to the rift's oscillation pattern, all systems nominal. The device activated. It was not dramatic. There were no explosions, no brilliant flashes of energy, no moment where reality visibly tore apart. Instead, there was a kind of settling, a harmony. The humming frequency of the Chronal Disruptor shifted, and somewhere in the fabric of spacetime, the rift which had been expanding with the patient inevitability of entropy itself, simply began to close. Not collapse, close. Like a door being shut from the inside, like a wound being sealed from both directions. The mathematics that had suggested this was impossible were apparently working with outdated software. The temporal matrix flickered once, twice, and then stabilized. The rift, which had been visible on every scanner, every observation system, every device that could perceive the damage to spacetime, simply ceased to exist. It didn't explode. It didn't create a secondary rupture. It did exactly what it was supposed to do and nothing more, which was actually more than most weapons ever achieved. The girl placed the final piece into her fourth puzzle. As the device completed its cycle, the last piece settled into place with a soft click. Landscape complete. Pattern finished. The universe saved through a combination of human stubbornness, lateral thinking, and one young woman's ability to see solutions in places where others saw only problems. It worked, someone said in the observation chamber. It was the kind of statement that seemed obvious after the fact but was genuinely surprising in the moment. Of course it worked, the girl replied, still looking at the now silent Chronal Disruptor. You just needed someone to stop overthinking it. In the negotiation chamber, the representatives of the collective were processing what they had just witnessed. Humanity had not just solved an impossible problem, they had done so while everyone watched, while everyone doubted, while everyone prepared contingency plans for failure. And they had succeeded not through superior resources or advanced technology, but through the kind of thinking that the collective classified as creative deviation from optimal procedure. This changes things. Crystalline consensus, 7 stated, its harmonic frequencies, carrying undertones of something that might have been grudging respect. The collective must formally recognize humanity's contribution to galactic stability. Effective immediately, humanity is classified as a protected species, requiring unanimous consent from the Council before any adverse action can be taken against them. It was a remarkable reversal. 12 hours ago, humanity had been considered a nuisance at best. Now they were protected by the same status that only the eldest and most powerful civilizations enjoyed. The collective had just publicly admitted that it could not afford to lose them. Witness recorded this moment with the precision of something that understood it, was witnessing a turning point in galactic history. The universe had just told every civilization that was paying attention one very clear message: never underestimate a species that thinks in puzzles. Across the station, scientists began celebrating in their various fashions. Some humans hugged, some silicon-based colleagues flickered in patterns that translated roughly to acceptable outcome achieved. The photonic delegates increased their luminosity. It was a celebration that transcended biological classification, united only by the shared experience of having survived something that was supposed to be unsurvivable. The head researcher found the girl sitting alone in the common area, staring at her collection of completed puzzles. 4 landscapes, each one perfectly assembled, each one a meditation on pattern and precision. You saved the universe, the researcher said. It wasn't a question. I pointed out something you all missed, the girl replied. You saved it. I just noticed that you were looking at it wrong. How did you see it? We had 3 teams of specialists working on this. We had algorithms, probability matrices, every analytical tool we could calibrate. And you, with your puzzles, figured out what all of that couldn't. The girl picked up one of the puzzles and rotated. Puzzles teach you about boundaries and possibilities. You look at the pieces and see individual elements. You have to learn to see the whole. When I watched you work, I saw you trying to force the pieces to fit in the pattern you had designed. But sometimes the pieces need to show you the pattern. Sometimes you have to listen to what wants to happen, instead of insisting on what you thought should happen. The researcher understood this in an abstract way. Humanity's entire journey through space had been defined by this exact principle. They broke the rules not out of malice, but out of an inability to see rules as anything other than suggestions. They listened to problems and allowed solutions to emerge in ways that made no theoretical sense but worked anyway. What will you do now? The researcher asked. Another puzzle, I think, the girl said. Or maybe sleep. I'm not entirely sure which comes first. In the days that followed, the galaxy processed what had happened. Humanity had gone from being classified as a species, with potential, to being classified as a species, with incomprehensible lateral thinking capabilities that made them simultaneously dangerous and invaluable. The collective established permanently as on offices, on human world. The harmonic communion requested collaborative research opportunities. Even the probability consortium, which usually maintained a position of strict neutrality, began exploring theoretical frameworks for understanding human cognition. The girl never received any official recognition. She never appeared in diplomatic records or historical documents. She was simply one of several support staff aboard Station Theta 7, the one who happened to notice that reality could be sealed the same way a puzzle could be completed, by understanding that sometimes you have to stop pushing and start observing. Years later, when historians looked back on this period, they would describe it as the moment humanity transcended its designated role in the galactic hierarchy. They would create elaborate theories about cognitive patterns and evolutionary advantage. They would write papers and give lectures about the fundamental differences between human problem solving and other species methodologies. None of them would ever fully capture what actually happened, which was that a young woman with a gift for pattern recognition had simply done what humans had always done, looked at an impossible situation, and found a way through it, not because she was brilliant, but because she was unwilling to accept that the situation was actually impossible. The universe had been waiting for that kind of stubborn refusal to accept limits. The universe had in fact been counting on it, because civilizations that played by the rules rarely survived the moments when the universe itself decided the rules no longer apply. And now, the universe had a species that understood, intuitively, that rules were only patterns waiting to be solved. The girl picked up a new puzzle from the vendor's latest shipment. This one depicted a city at night, lights glowing against darkness, buildings reaching toward stars that seemed impossibly distant. She sorted the pieces into piles, began constructing the borders, and settled into the meditative work of making sense out of fragments. Somewhere in the collective's archives, witness continued recording. The universe had just rearranged itself, and nobody was quite sure what came next. But that was fine. If there was one thing humanity had proven, it was that they were very good at figuring things out as they went along, even if it meant changing the course of galactic history in the process. Chat control.